This is the beginning segment on the chapter on drugs. So we will first discuss the rules or the law concerning drugs. The primary emphasis in this chapter is going to be, of course, those drugs that law enforcement is interested in, and therefore the ones that are confiscated and sent to the crime laboratories. The United States government passed a uniform drug controller called the Controlled Substances Act, and most of the states have similar laws regulating substances that are considered dangerous and highly abusive. So what they did was looked at all of the compounds, primarily the ones that are being abused a lot and that have a high potential for addiction, and they essentially rated them according to their degree of dangerousness. And they made a list of the most dangerous ones and put them in what they called Schedule 1, or List Number 1. Substances within the Schedule 1 are those which have the highest potential for abuse, which the primary definition of abuse is potential for addiction, and that they don't have a generally accepted medical use. Those Schedule 1 controlled substances are prohibited. You can't own them, you can't possess them, you can't manufacture them, you can't sell them. Doctors can't write prescriptions for them, and if you're going to do research on them, you have to have permits from the government to allow you to do research. So they're very, very tightly controlled, and the penalties for possession or manufacture or sale of Schedule 1s are quite harsh. There's not a lot, there's quite a long list of Schedule 1 controlled substances, but the primary ones that we're concerned with are the well-known worst, what we think of as worst drugs. Now, you need to know that the word controlled in this instance is the legal term, controlled. It doesn't mean that they're regulated. It means that they're on the list. So they're only controlled substances if they are on the controlled substance list. Alcohol, for example, while particularly in Utah, it's highly controlled, but it's not on the list, so it's not a controlled substance. Lots of other things that you think should be on there may or may not be on there, and you may disagree with how they put the substances on. There are some things on Schedule 1 that you may not think should be on Schedule 1, and there's some things in Schedule 2 that maybe you think ought to be in Schedule 1, but we're free to have our opinion, but that doesn't change the law. The law is the law, and the law is what's written down. So what is written down in the law as a controlled substance, in the crime lab, we don't make the laws. We just identify the stuff that comes in. So you're free to have your own opinion, but won't change the facts of the matter. I have my own opinions as well, and by and large, I try to keep my individual opinions to myself and let you make your own. So let's talk about the Controlled Substances Act And I have a little chart that I will present, and we'll talk over that as we go along. Some of you are going to say, well, marijuana doesn't belong in Schedule 1 and it has a legitimate medical use. That may be, and I don't argue that, but I'm just telling you marijuana is a Schedule 1, and amphetamines and methamphetamines and OxyContin and fentanyl and cocaine, which in some ways are equally as bad as or maybe worse than marijuana, are Schedule 2s. But it's not our decision. That's the way the law was written, and it's difficult once it's written to go back and put something in a different schedule. Schedule 3, there's some lower concentrations of opiates, like some of the codeines, Tylenol with codeine, for example, and anabolic steroids, which are not to be confused with corticosteroids. Anabolic steroids are derivatives of testosterone and are used to build muscle mass. We will now take each of the major drugs and deal with them particularly to understand how they are identified. I will include a number of pictures to illustrate my points. The most common controlled substance is marijuana, of course. We are having a number of changes to marijuana laws, but it remains a Schedule 1 controlled substance under federal law and also under Utah law. Marijuana is a plant, and here is the scientific name of the plant, Cannabis sativa. There is only one species of marijuana, which is Cannabis sativa. However, there are varying levels of the psychoactive ingredient, which is tetrahydrocannabinol. Below 0.3% THC, it is referred to as hemp rather than marijuana, and is legal because it is a valuable source of fiber material. The marijuana plant contains a number of compounds called cannabinoids. There are a fairly large number of cannabinoids, some of which are psychoactive and some of which are not. The primary psychoactive compounds are delta 9 and delta 8 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. Here is a chart representing those compounds. Don't worry, you won't need to memorize any chemical formulas. I merely wanted to illustrate that there are numerous compounds that are chemically somewhat similar and are in the category of cannabinoids. No other plant has been found to contain cannabinoids. Marijuana is a hardy plant that grows best in most temperate climates and is easily grown in hothouses or greenhouses. It will grow quite well in Utah and in most parts of the United States. Here is a picture of a marijuana plant. notice that the leaves are clumped in leaflet form. The leaflets are always in an odd number, that is 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Typically 5 is the common number of leaflets per leaf. The second slide showed two marijuana plants side by side. The one on the left is a male plant. The one on the right is a female plant. The female plants are more desirable to marijuana users because they contain a higher level of THC. Period. They oftentimes, in the cultivation of marijuana, will only grow female plants. You can do this by starting them from a cutting or waiting until they germinate and grow a little bit, and then you can tell them apart, and you can just pull up the male plants and let the female plants keep going. This slide shows a marijuana bust which occurred several years ago. It was the largest marijuana bust in the history of Utah. 12.5 tons of marijuana were recovered. They subsequently needed to destroy them, so we took the marijuana out to the test and training range in western Tooele County and arranged them in the little pit there and poured diesel fuel on them and lit them. It was a wild and crazy fire. But that is you can notice the way that the marijuana was packaged in bulk. It's packaged in bales, slightly smaller than a typical hay bale, but convenient for transporting larger quantities. Smaller amounts are usually compressed and packaged in the form of bricks, which are usually called kilos or Ks. They don't usually weigh a kilo because drug dealers are not very honest, and they usually shortchange you. But the bricks are usually wrapped in that orange or yellow coated paper, and it is recognizable because I've not seen other drugs packaged in that kind of paper. So that's a good thing to look for when you're at a crime scene. If you see that kind of paper laying around, you can think, well, there's been some marijuana here, and if you collect that paper, you can oftentimes find residue in there to verify that marijuana has been. Marijuana can be used in many ways. As long as you get it in your body, it will give you the desired effect. You can eat it, you can cook it and make it into brownies. You can put it in liquid and mix it up with whatever alcoholic beverages or whatever and drink it. But most commonly it's smoked. And these are some marijuana cigarettes, easily identified as being not commercially made because they're rolled up and pinched on the ends and so forth. So they smoke them as cigarettes, and marijuana cigarettes, of course, have dozens of nicknames, and then they want to smoke them all the way down because they don't want to waste any marijuana, or if you leave the marijuana cigarette butt laying around, then you can get arrested for that. Marijuana cigarette butt is called a roach. So they make all kinds of roach clips, and I'll show you a couple of them. Anything that will squeeze together that you can hold the roach in can be made into a roach clip, and they're very ingenious and creative sometimes in making their paraphernalia. Here are some examples of pipes that could be used. The first one is if you want to get stoned, The second one is made from antlers from an elk. The third one is a gas mask. The fourth one is some PVC pipe. The next one is a cartridge case welded onto another cartridge case. And then comes a flashlight. I guess that's if you want to get turned on. The next one is a toothpaste tube so that your breath will smell good afterwards. And the last is a Coca-Cola can. Just a few of the limitless kinds of marijuana pipes that I have had submitted to the laboratory over the years. Marijuana paraphernalia typically has sufficient residue on it to conduct an analysis. In our area, paraphernalia is only illegal if it does have sufficient residue on it to be deemed a positive marijuana. Other aspects of the marijuana, there are other ways of using it. Sometimes they take the plant material and extract the cannabinoids with solvents. If they dry that, they end up with a material called hashish, which looks like soft tar. It's black and it's usually found in small chunks. I will put a picture up to show you what it looks like. Here is a picture of some small chunks of hashish. The identification of marijuana is a rather simple process if we do not need to quantitate the levels of THC. It is accomplished by first looking at the sample with your naked eyes and also taking a little sniff of it to determine if it smells like marijuana. And on the visual, you want to make sure there aren't any obvious impurities mixed in with it. After you have determined that it is grossly consistent with marijuana, you next examine it under a dissecting or stereoscopic microscope. That is the kind of microscope that allows you to see things in low magnification and in relative 3 dimensions. The kind that you probably used in public schools to look at frogs or dissect worms, etc. In any event, a small pinch of marijuana is placed on a spot plate and examined at about 10x magnification, and we're looking for a particular characteristic set of hairs. Now, they're not hairs as in mammal hairs. They're just little growths on the surface of plants that botanists call hairs. There are numerous kinds and sizes and shapes. Marijuana has a particularly characteristic type of hair called a cystolithic, 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 which interpreted as a bag of stones. The cystolithic hair is a hair made from calcium carbonate. So lots of plants have cystolithic hairs, but most of them do not look like those that are on the marijuana plant. I will demonstrate with some pictures. This is a photograph of a cystolithic hair taken with the aid of a scanning electron microscope. It is greatly magnified, but you can see the base is quite broad, and it tapers out rather quickly to a point. It's oftentimes called a steer horn, sometimes called other things, but it's quite characteristic, and of course you can't see it that well under low power magnification. So I will now put in a picture of what you would see using a dissecting microscope. This picture shows a typical example of the hairs on a small bit of marijuana. Here is another shot. You will note there are a variety of different hair types, but the cystolithic hairs are the most important for identification purposes. This picture shows some very nice cystolithic hairs on the rectangular piece that is on the left side of the screen, about in the middle. There are two very nice cystolithic hairs present there. I also like to look at a seed or two. They are quite characteristic of marijuana, and I have not seen other seeds that looked like them. Notice they're shaped like little lemons. They're about 4 or 5 millimeters long and have lines all over the top. When they're fresh, they are dark green, but as they dry out, they turn brown. If the microscopic examination is positive, that is, you have found the hairs and identified the cystolithic and other types of hairs, the next step is a chemical test, which consists of 3 steps. First, you put a few pieces of marijuana in a spot plate or suitable spot and add what is called the Duquesnoy reagent. That's Duquenois. It is a mixture of acetaldehyde, vanillin, and alcohol. A few drops of the Duquesnoy reagent are sprinkled onto the marijuana, and that is followed by a roughly equal amount of hydrochloric acid. The liquid will extract the cannabinoids from the plant material and will turn a blue, dark blue color. This should take approximately 20 to 30 seconds. That color is somewhat variable, but must be at least some shade of blue. The third step is to add a few drops of chloroform. The chloroform is not soluble in the Duquesnoy reagent and will form a separate droplet in the spot plate or at the bottom of a test tube. The chloroform will extract a violet color from the Duquesnoy reagent, and you will then have a dual color either in the test tube or in the spot plate, depending on which you used, of violet and blue. Failure to get the violet is a negative test. Many people have suggested that the Duquesnoy is not specific to marijuana, and it is true that other materials may turn colors. However, none of them look like marijuana, either grossly or microscopically, and I have not found any common materials that will turn the proper sequence of colors using the Duquesnoy test. The microscopic examination and the Duquesnoy test have been used jointly to identify marijuana in literally millions of cases, and have been ruled admissible as positive identification of marijuana. I personally have probably done maybe 10,000 such samples, and have testified numerous times. So it's a relatively simple process. It's quick, and it's inexpensive. You know, the reagents are very simple to mix up, and they last quite a long time. It is important to make sure that on a regular basis you test the reagents to make sure they have not expired. In our laboratory, we would test the Duquesnoy Levine reagents every morning before we did a marijuana identification to make sure that they were working properly. Other more sophisticated identification techniques are used if the sample does not lend itself to microscopic examination, such as a residue in a pipe or other paraphernalia, or if you need to quantitate the THC level in order to determine that it is above the 0.3% THC. We will discuss these more sophisticated tests further on in the lecture. In the meantime, we can consider marijuana identified for the purposes of ordinary, everyday courtroom. The opium poppy is the source of all of the drugs that we call opioids. The opium poppy, a scientific name Papaver somniferum, is a flower somewhat similar to the garden California poppies that you might see growing in the summertime around here, but the opium poppy is a different species and is not typically found in the United States. I personally have never seen a growing opium poppy plant. I have seen dried plants and dried leaves and so forth, but the plant is, as far as I know, not a source of opium in the United States. The opium that we get is all imported. Here is a picture of an opium poppy flower. When the petals fall off, we are left with a small bulb-shaped object. This bulb is sliced at the appropriate time, and a sap-type material oozes out of the bulb.
This material is scraped off and dried and becomes opium.
Opium is not a popular compound in the United States. It is and has been very popular in other parts of the world for many hundreds of years. It is often smoked, and if you want to see a pipe that's used to smoke opium, called a hookah, you should watch Walt Disney's Alice in Wonderland. The pipe that the caterpillar is smoking is a hookah. Now, I don't know if the caterpillar was smoking opium or if Alice was smoking opium, but in any event, that's the way it's typically used, but it's also oftentimes put in liquid preparations and used in other ways. The opium is the original source of morphine and codeine and a number of other opiates, which are used in legitimate medical operations. Morphine, for example, is still considered one of, if not the best, painkillers. After World War I, there were many Americans, particularly soldiers returning from the war, that were addicted to morphine because when they were wounded, they didn't have helicopters to evacuate them. They didn't have the kind of medical treatments that we have now in our wars. And so they were given opium to sustain them until they could somehow get evacuated and get to a hospital. So they became addicted to morphine. In an attempt to solve this problem, doctors discovered and invented new medicines, one of which was diacetyl morphine, also named heroin. So heroin was used, at least temporarily, as a possible substitute for morphine. And it does help you get off morphine, but then you become addicted to heroin, which is worse. So, but that's the origin of heroin. And it is, in fact, a very closely related chemical to heroin, to morphine. Morphine is the basic compound from which heroin is made. In fact, when you take heroin, or when an individual takes heroin, I hope you won't, but when an individual takes heroin, your body very rapidly converts it from heroin to morphine. When someone dies of a heroin overdose, the toxicology report will say morphine, not heroin, because it's been converted. In the manufacture or in the production of heroin, if it's done carefully and skillfully, the resulting heroin is a white powder. Oftentimes, if it's not completed, the conversion process is not completed properly, it will end up brown. Most of the heroin which we get in Utah is brown heroin. In the East, they get white heroin, which comes out of France, originally grown probably in Afghanistan or in that general area, and sent to France, where it's converted to heroin and then shipped to the United States. So in any event, it's a powder, and the early uses of heroin utilized the powder. They would mostly inject it, which standard ejection procedure is to put a bit of the powder in a spoon, usually a larger tablespoon, add a little bit of water and maybe a small piece of cotton as a filter, and take the liquid in the spoon and heat it with a lighter or a match or a small butane torch, and that will help to dissolve the heroin into the liquid, and then to extract the liquid, suck it up into a syringe or an eyedropper, and inject it into the body, usually into a vein. But if they want the high to last a little longer, sometimes they will inject it into a large muscle, such as the thigh muscle. But in any event, it very rapidly assimilates into the body and produces the desired effect.
Here is a picture of the effects of injecting heroin into the thigh muscle and the subsequent infections.
During my early career, heroin arrests in Utah were relatively few. That is because there were not a lot of heroin users. Heroin is very expensive. If you're an injector of heroin, you're buying the powder, it usually comes in quantities of 1/4 of a teaspoon. Of that 1/4 teaspoon of powder, usually around 5% would be heroin. The rest would be adulterants and fillers. But a 1/4 teaspoon would cost in those days between $70 and $100. And if you're a heroin addict, you would certainly want one every day, and maybe 2 every day. Not many of us, not me certainly, has an extra $70 every day to spend on heroin. So many of them turn to lives of crime, and that's why law enforcement is so interested in cutting down on drug use and drug sales and so forth. In any event, about in the 90s, they started making a different form of heroin. They didn't refine it all the way down to a powder stage. They stopped a couple of steps early and ended up with a product that is kind of like thick tar, and if it dries out, it almost becomes crusty, but it's dark brown, almost a black color, and they call it black tar heroin. The black tar heroin is usually not injected, although it can be. Simply dissolve it and inject it. But you can also take it other ways. They call it smoking. It's not the same as smoking because they don't burn the heroin. They simply heat it to a temperature at which it volatilizes, turns to a gas, and then they inhale the fumes. That's also the way they smoke crack and cocaine. But that became a more popular way to use heroin, and the practical price of heroin dropped dramatically because a small piece of black tar heroin could take the place of a 1/4 teaspoon maybe of the powder, and could be purchased for $20, $25. Black tar heroin became very popular and easily accessible. Instead of only a handful of heroin dealers, now you can buy black tar heroin from lots and lots of different people. And occasionally we even see it for sale by street vendors. Guys on the street have a little heroin, they'll flag you down, you want to buy some? So the use of heroin has really increased, and the number of drug arrests for the use of heroin has increased along with it.
A common packaging technique for powder heroin is to place it in a small balloon and tie the top Usually that's their preferred method for powder heroin. And so if you're doing a search and you see parts of balloons or the top of a balloon with a knot in it, you can think that they were injecting and probably injecting heroin.
Black tar heroin is usually packaged in small pieces about the size of a pencil eraser or smaller, and tied in the corner of a plastic bag or in aluminum foil. Heroin, unlike marijuana, is quite toxic, and you can easily overdose and die from heroin, particularly since the production is not controlled or regulated, so you never know exactly how much heroin you're taking when you take a dose. It might be 5%, it might be lower, it might be higher. If it's significantly higher and you take the same dose that you've been taking, then that might be too much. It might overcome your ability to survive. Heroin is what we call a downer, meaning it's a depressant. So it slows down your heart rate and slows down your respiration. And if you take enough of it, it slows it down until it stops and you just die. We have lots of heroin overdoses in the country every year. As far as the identification of heroin, we have a good color test for the presence of opiates called the Marquis, Marquis. It is equal parts of formaldehyde and sulfuric acid. When you put a drop or two of that on a suspected drug sample, if there is an opiate, heroin, morphine, opium, the resulting color is a violet, develops quite rapidly. If it's heroin, you will see small areas of violet develop because there's only small areas of heroin present. So it doesn't distinguish between the different opiates, but it certainly indicates that you have an opiate, and if it's packaged in a balloon, it's very likely heroin, but confirmation is accomplished using more sophisticated equipment that we'll discuss later in the lecture. Now we turn to the next controlled substance in the Schedule 1 category, and that is LSD.
LSD is also known as lysergic acid diethylamide. Lysergic acid seems to go with the name. However, the original name of it was in the German, and so LSD was easily reduced from the lysergic acid diethylamide in German to LSD in German, and we just kept the title.
LSD is actually a white powder, but you'll never see the powder, or you're not likely to, because the preparations that dispense LSD have such a low concentration that if you take a normal hit of LSD, it may be as low as 100 micrograms, or maybe even less. 100 micrograms in the bottom of a test tube, you have to look very closely to realize that it's not just a speck of dust. So that's a very, very small amount, and not practical for selling or dispensing. And so to overcome that problem, they put it in other kinds of things. Oftentimes, when they're making LSD, the last step is the LSD is dissolved in a solvent, and so they can take a few drops of the solvent and drop it onto a piece of paper, or drop it onto a tablet that is a pill, such as an aspirin pill, or in the old days a sugar cube, or of course they can make their own pills and put the LSD in their own pills. Sometimes they even just take the liquid and take it directly, like a drop. They may, if you're having a party, they can put a little bit of liquid in a dropper. A convenient one is the kind that you sometimes see in with food coloring in them that has a kind of a pointy top. So they take the lid off and put LSD containing liquid in there and put the top back on, and then they can squeeze it out a drop at a time. So if you're at a party and everybody wants to have a hit, you can just have them stick out their tongue, and you can drop a drop of it on their tongue or in the corner of their eye or wherever else you want, I suppose, as long as it gets into your body, it will work. And you can dispense it that way. The paper is probably the most common way that we see it nowadays. So I'll show you a few pictures of the kind of LSD papers that are around. Here is a sheet of LSD blotter paper or blotter acid. You can see the perforations. Each of those little perforations, each of those squares would contain about a hit of LSD. So if you were buying that, you might want to get a perforation or a square that has the dragon in it to make it more psychedelic or whatever. But in any event, one of those squares would be sufficient for a high, and it's relatively cheap. You can buy it for maybe $5 a hit, and so it's become somewhat popular again. It went out of style for a few years, but seems to be making a little bit of a comeback now. Here are some squares that might be appropriate for the upcoming Easter with the Easter bunny on them. And here's Joe Cool, Snoopy. This is a different application. Each of those little rectangles on the paper are little chunks of capsule material. So they are impregnated as the material is made, and it dissolves very quickly, and so it's a nice way of taking the LSD and not having to worry about a piece of paper in your mouth and you have to spit it out and so forth. Anyway, that's just another way. They call that that window pane acid. The small dot next to the penny on the left is actually a pill. They call it a microdot. It's very small, and it contains a dose of LSD that is equivalent to one of the squares of paper or one of the little sections of capsule material. The advantage to the microdot, of course, is that it's easily hidden. You could have 50 of those in your pocket, and no police officer would detect it doing a pat down, or maybe even going through your clothes. So one of the reasons LSD has become more popular is that if you've taken LSD, if you've taken in 50 or 100 micrograms into your body, and it's distributed throughout your body in your blood, then it would be very, very, very small amount of it present if you had a random blood sample extracted. So quite often LSD is not detected in the regular protocols of drug testing. So that makes it desirable for those who want to take drugs and not get caught. For a number of years, LSD lost its popularity around the time of the Beatles and their popularity. Songs like "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." LSD was really the rage, but then it got some bad publicity and dropped off in popularity for 20 or so years. But it's made a bit of a comeback, and now when you talk about Schedule I drugs, it has to be in the top 6 or 8 most popular controlled substances. LSD fluoresces pale blue under UV light, regular ultraviolet light, or alternate light source. Of course, lots of other things also fluoresce blue, so it is not a positive test for LSD, but if you have a white paper and you shine a UV light on it and it doesn't fluoresce pale blue, it likely did not have LSD in it. So it's a pretty good negative test, but not one that you can use to positively identify LSD. There's another color test using the chemical para-dimethylamino-benzaldehyde. You won't need to memorize how to spell that one. But with alcohol and hydrochloric acid, that will turn a purple color if it's LSD. It is a pretty sensitive and pretty reliable color test for LSD, but of course it's not a confirmatory, and you need to use additional confirmatory tests to positively identify LSD. The para-dimethylamino-benzaldehyde test is sometimes called PDAB, P-D-A-B, sometimes called Van Erks, and sometimes called Ehrlich's. It's the same test. It works the same way. It's just different name for the same test. Next, we will discuss hallucinogenic mushrooms. There are a number of mushroom species. No one knows exactly how many, but probably 150 or so different species that contain psilocybin or psilocin. These are controlled substances. Those two compounds and any mushrooms containing them are considered controlled substance themselves. There are, as I mentioned, numerous species of mushrooms that contain psilocin. Most of them are regular, what you think of as regular mushrooms, with a cap and a stem, and underneath this cap is what we call a guild. That is, there are lines of spore-producing plant substances. Some mushrooms have a sponge-like undersurface. These are not usually hallucinogenic mushrooms. This is a picture of some psilocybe mushrooms that are representative of what most of them look like. They don't normally grow around Utah. You will occasionally find them, but not many people search for hallucinogenic mushrooms in this area. In the Northwest, I have a brother who lives up there in Seattle, and he says that occasionally after a rainy period, which is Seattle, then he sees people out looking in lawns for mushrooms. Some of the species that do grow in lawns and are, what we would think of as domestic, and I don't recommend that you eat or use wild mushrooms unless you're very familiar with what you're doing, because, of course, some of them are deadly poisonous. Here's another photograph of different species of mushrooms. Also contains psilocybin and psilocin. Most users of mushrooms dry them and then use them in various recipes. They're primarily ingested orally, and the occasional person who will freeze them, that's not as satisfactory as drying them because they're kind of messy when they thaw out and so forth. So usually when you see mushrooms that are on the street, they're in a plastic baggie and they look like dried up, bunched up mushrooms, which is what they are. For many years, we didn't have a color test for mushrooms. However, in our laboratory at Weber State, one day one of our associates was kind of experimenting a little bit and happened to drop a solution of dye, a dye called Fast Blue B, on the mushrooms, and they changed color. And he got excited, and so we messed around with that and came up with what we call the Weber test. The world calls it the Weber test, or the Fast Blue B test for mushrooms. We discovered that if you put a solution of Fast Blue B on the mushrooms, the color test turns red, and if you then put hydrochloric acid on, the color will change to blue. We have subsequently tested several hundred various mushrooms, and the only ones that test positive with this test are those that subsequently have been determined to have the psilocybin or psilocin in them. So we think it's a good test. I don't think anyone uses it as a confirmatory test, but lots of laboratories around the United States and maybe Canada, maybe Europe, I don't know. Lots of laboratories have adopted this as a preliminary test for the presence of mushrooms. So one of the accomplishments of the Weber State Laboratory. Confirmation of psilocybin is accomplished by instrumentation. It is a bit tricky because the psilocybin tends to break down under heat, and one of the tests which we use, called gas chromatography, requires a heated oven, and so we've had to modify that for the testing of hallucinogenic mushroom. Occasionally we will have a magic mushroom growing operation that is discovered in Utah. Typically they put the spores in a small jar, like a pint canning jar, along with some partially decomposing material, sometimes rice, sometimes wheat, and then the mushrooms will sprout and the fruits will be harvested. We have tried to duplicate that in our laboratory with absolutely no success. I guess we don't know the proper incantations or whatever it takes to make the mushrooms grow, but the spores in some states are legal to possess. They do not contain psilocin or psilocybin, so you can buy them online. But as soon as the mushroom fruits grows, then it becomes a Schedule I controlled substance. Next, we will discuss peyote. Peyote is derived, or is a cactus, and I will now show you the scientific name of the peyote cactus. Lophophora williamsii,
is the peyote cactus. It is a small, pretty much spineless cactus. I'll show you a photograph of it now. The peyote cactus is grown in the southwestern portion of the United States and Mexico, and has been utilized by Native Americans in their religious ceremonies for hundreds of years. After the peyote cactus was made a first schedule controlled substance, the Native American Church sued the government, claiming that it was a violation of their freedom of religion, and they should be allowed to use it since they had been using it for many, many years, hundreds of years probably. Ultimately, the Supreme Court agreed and carved out an exception for the members of the Native American Church to possess and use peyote in their ceremonies. That has resulted in a good deal of confusion, and as a result, most of the time law enforcement officers do not seek out prosecution for possession or sale of peyote. The ingredient in cactus that is dangerous is mescaline. So mescaline is a controlled substance. It is derived from buds that grow out from the base of the cactus plant. These are called buttons. They are sliced and dried, and the resultant material is ground up, and it may be taken in various ways. Again, mostly oral or in drinks, but we rarely see it in the crime laboratory, and we have no good color tests. Here is a picture of what the material looks like when it is ground up. We will now move to Schedule 2 controlled substances. They are still highly abusive, and certainly they are tightly controlled. If a pharmacy sells them, they must get a prescription from a doctor, and they must keep their Schedule 2 drugs separate from other drugs. They must keep close inventories of them, and they are subject to inspections by the federal and state authorities to make sure they're obeying. So the major differences between Schedule 1s and Schedule 2s are: 1, you may get a prescription for a Schedule 2 controlled substance, and 2, they are deemed to be more legitimate medicines. That is, there are generally accepted medical uses for Schedule 2s, some of which are a bit obsolete, but for example, amphetamines were very commonly prescribed for weight control and other maladies for a number of years before they were ultimately decided to be put on the list as Schedule 2s. So things evolve, and schedules evolve and change all the time. The information I'm giving you is up to date as far as the federal and Utah laws are concerned right now. Looking back at the chart I listed earlier in my lecture on drugs, you can see that amphetamine, methamphetamine, opium, morphine, cocaine, Percodan, OxyContin, fentanyl are Schedule 2 controlled substance. It says we'll deal with them individually. The final Schedule 1 drug we will discuss is ecstasy. ECSTACY. That's why. It is a somewhat generic term that covers
a number of what we call designer drugs, most commonly MDA and MDMA. Designer drugs are drugs that have been formulated in clandestine or illegal laboratories to closely resemble a legal drug. In the case of ecstasy, they are analogs of amphetamine and methamphetamine. The drug people have figured out a way to, at least temporarily, get around the Controlled Substances Act. As you will recall, if a compound is not listed on one of the schedules, it is not controlled. So they take the molecule, examine the molecule of an illegal drug, and alter it such that it is no longer the exact same as those listed on the Controlled Substance Act. And so they're not controlled. They go out on the street and they're sold, and they're dangerous, oftentimes very dangerous, oftentimes very poorly prepared, and little is known about them. So they remain legal until the laboratory gets some in and identifies exactly what it is, and then they will submit to the Attorney General the dangerousness of the drug. The Attorney General will investigate and make a determination, and they have the opportunity then to place it on a schedule or not, depending on how dangerous they decide it is, and decide what schedule it is, and then it can become law. In Utah, the procedure is basically the same. And so then, of course, it's a controlled substance, and they sometimes they become very popular, and they get sold often, and sometimes they then have to end up having major investigations, and when that occurs, then the chemists go back to work and try to find another one. That's why they call them designer drugs, because they have been designed to closely resemble already known drugs, but are not on the controlled substances list. Ecstasy has been around long enough that it has gone through the procedure and has been listed, and several of the ecstasy drugs are Schedule 1s. All ecstasy pills are manufactured illegally, and there are dozens and dozens of pills with various and sundry markings on them. If I gave you pictures of them, it would be a very small representation of the number of drugs that are out there. And that, of course, is one of the other dangers of that sort of business, is that you really don't know what you're taking when you take an ecstasy pill. They are almost all pills. Some are round, some are heart-shaped, some are oval, some are blue, some are white, some are gray, some are green. Some have pictures on them, and some of them have other logos and icons on them. So the only way to identify them is by the equipment that we will be talking about in our section on identification, which will come later. Amphetamine and methamphetamine are Schedule II controlled substances. They are very closely related chemically. Methamphetamine, if you add a methyl or CH3 group to it, it becomes methamphetamine. They have been extremely popular drugs for a long, long time. In the 70s and 80s, amphetamines and methamphetamines were sold by the thousands. In those days, they were mostly pressed into pills from large quantities of bulk drug that they could purchase. For example, if a group wanted to sell methamphetamine, they could buy multiple pounds from a pharmaceutical company and then press their own pills and sell them illegally, which happened quite regularly. The nicknames were Speed and other similar names, and the pills mostly were small white pills with a crosshatch on them. I'll show you a picture.
Here is a picture of a cross top. They could have been methamphetamine or amphetamine. They looked the same, and they were extremely popular and available up until about the very early 90s, when the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration began to crack down on the sale of methamphetamine and amphetamine by large pharmaceutical companies. About the same time, doctors decided to stop prescribing amphetamine for weight loss and so forth. And so the market sort of dried up, and you could still buy the pills, you could still find them around, but they stopped being amphetamine and methamphetamine. They would be whatever the group could find that was white. They would press into a pill, and sometimes it was like an antihistamine, sometimes it was just, something not even a medicine at all. So the market kind of died for a while. Eventually, since the demand was still there, people began to manufacture the amphetamines on their own.
Turned out there are several relatively easy procedures for making methamphetamine and amphetamine, and these were quickly adapted to homemade laboratories, clandestine, and the use of methamphetamines actually increased as a result of these clandestine laboratories. At one point, Utah was like fourth in the nation in the number of clandestine laboratories which were discovered for primarily methamphetamine. One of the methods used to manufacture methamphetamine used a chemical called phenylacetone. This was it is a closely related chemical to methamphetamine, and a simple one-step or two-step process would result in a batch of methamphetamine. Pretty soon the authorities caught on to that and decided to make phenylacetone a restricted chemical, and so the majority of the states did that, and Utah did not for a while. So the drug dealers got the idea, and they would come to Utah and buy their phenylacetone and take it back to California and manufacture drugs. But then they thought, well, wait a minute, why do we bring it back? Let's just make it in Utah and take the finished product back. So that's why Utah became such a nice little hotbed for manufacturing of methamphetamine. So methamphetamine now and amphetamine are usually not sold as pills, but are sold as powder which they oftentimes call crystal meth. It's a white powder, very similar in some aspects to cocaine. Usually the methamphetamine has more off-white, more of a bone or brownish hint to it. Cocaine is usually pretty pure white. But nevertheless, we had two white powders to deal with, and we'll talk about how you distinguish them. But in the meantime, let's get back to methamphetamine and see what we need to talk about there. So now methamphetamine is typically packaged like white powders, and one of the common ways to make a package is to make a little a bindle. That's a bindle. So we'll take a minute and I'll show you how to make a bindle. A bindle is a nice little way of packaging material so you don't lose any of it, and it's cheap. So you take a piece of paper and you fold it across like so. Then you fold a flap in there, fold this down and tuck the top in, and the material inside won't get lost. And so that's a good way to package drugs. And quite often you see cocaine or amphetamine packaged in bindles. Learn something new every day. Lots of amphetamine and methamphetamine powders are also packaged in aluminum foil and so forth. Methamphetamine has been often referred to by law enforcement as their biggest drug problem. There are lots and lots of people addicted to methamphetamine, and it is a drug that has a reputation for creating bad tempers in people who are high. It may or may not, I don't know, but that's the reputation that it has. The color test for amphetamines and methamphetamines is the same one as the one for heroin, which is the Marquis. However, instead of turning violet, the liquid in the methamphetamine test will turn brown. It turns a light colored brown first, and that's the color that you're looking for a positive. After a very short time, the color will darken and turn into a dark brown, which is the color of sugar. And there's often sugars that are used to cut the methamphetamine or dilute it, as you might think. And so you want to look for that light brown color. I will put up a short video demonstrating the Marquis test. First, I will add the sulfuric acid to the powder, and nothing happens when that enters. And so then you put in the formaldehyde, which will become next, and immediately you get a light brown color down like at 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock, and then that fades away and is covered up by the darker colored, which is the sugar. The light brown color is what's important for identification or for the positive test for methamphetamine or amphetamine. That picture that we just saw is what is called a soak. Sometimes when they are preparing to inject a sample of amphetamine or heroin or whatever, they will suck the liquid up through a piece of cotton to act as a sort of filter. Then when they're done, they put the piece of cotton in a jar. It's wet cotton, and so that's why they call it a soak. And then later on, if they are in an emergency and they can't get their drugs, they can pull the cotton out of the soak jar, and there's enough drug in there for them to get by. So that's what those pictures were after the Marquis test. The Marquis does not distinguish between amphetamine and methamphetamine. If it tests positive, you just say there is an amphetamine or methamphetamine positive test. It's a good test, but it has its limitations, as do all of the color tests. They are not confirmatory, they are presumptive tests. We presume that the material we're testing for is present, and then we proceed to do confirmatory tests. In this case, either infrared spectrophotometry or gas chromatography or mass spectrometry, which we will discuss in the next video. There is another color test which can be a follow-up to the Marquis. It is called sodium nitroprusside. It's listed among the tests that are on the end of your syllabus. Sodium nitroprusside turns blue only with methamphetamine, not amphetamine, but it also turns blue with some other compounds. So if you test with the Marquis and then with the sodium nitroprusside, you have a positive test for methamphetamine or amphetamine, and then with the nitroprusside, you only have a positive test for methamphetamine. So that's a good sequence to use. The manufacture of methamphetamine in clandestine labs is diminished greatly in the last few years. Most of the methamphetamine that we see now is smuggled in from Mexico or other countries. If you do run into a situation where you think there is a methamphetamine clandestine lab, we advise not entering because there are dangers. Some poisonous gases are often generated if the people don't know what they're doing and make mistakes in the production. So it's best to call in a specialized team to process drug laboratories, clandestine drug laboratories. If you do need to go in, you should at least equip yourself with the ventilation equipment so that you won't be poisoned, and be extremely careful because it's easy to ignite fire or even an explosion. Some of the chemicals used are quite volatile. So I don't go into clandestine labs anymore, and those few I did go in were only when they had not completed the process or just had the chemicals still in bottles and waiting for the start of the process. The next drug that we will discuss is cocaine. Cocaine is a derivative of the leaves of the coca plant, not to be confused with the cacao plant for which you get hot chocolate. The coca plant is scientific name Erythroxylon coca. It is a shrub that grows in best in mid-level elevations, such as the lower slopes of the Andes Mountains in South America. Here is a picture of a coca leaf and flower. You will not likely see them. They don't grow around here. Occasionally you see an imported leaf dried out, but most of the cocaine is processed near where it's harvested, and you see the cocaine hydrochloride
imported as a powder.
Here is a picture of cocaine, pure cocaine, purchased from the pharmacy. You will notice how pretty and white, and it looks a little bit like fresh powdery snow. We purchased that bottle of cocaine for $8. It was an ounce of pure cocaine. In that time, many years ago, cocaine on the street was selling for about $2,000 an ounce. But the cocaine on the street normally is about 30, maybe 40% pure. So from that bottle of cocaine, we could have cut it and got at least 3 ounces of street cocaine. So the value of that was about $6,000. We paid $8. That shows why there are so many people willing to get into the drug business. It's extremely lucrative. Cocaine dealers, sometimes the heads of the organizations have mansions, and they have helicopters, and they have guards that protect their facilities and their homes. They're millionaires, and sometimes even more, but cocaine is certainly still a very important drug as far as law enforcement is concerned. And the identification of cocaine starts with a color test, sometimes called the Scott's test, sometimes called cobalt thiocyanate. Cobalt thiocyanate is the active ingredient in the test. It is dissolved, and then the liquid is dropped onto a small sample of suspected cocaine. The cocaine will turn blue very quickly. It is a very good test. Of course, it's a color test, and so once again, it's not confirmatory for purposes of prosecution. However, it will be reported out as having tested positive for cocaine, and these days, oftentimes, that's sufficient if the individual decides to plead guilty, or if there's a plea negotiation, and so forth. But in any event, cocaine is one drug that we also quantitate. That is, we determine the concentration of the cocaine. We do that using a gas chromatograph, and it is helpful information, but not necessary for prosecution. The general rule is, if there is the drug is present, the concentration does not affect any further litigation or prosecution. You can have a tiny amount of cocaine in a large amount of sugar, and that's as illegal as pure cocaine. As I mentioned earlier, the cocaine normally seen in the United States is what we call cocaine powder, and it is cocaine hydrochloride. That is, if you're a chemist, they will call that a salt, and it is usually taken by snorting. Snorting means to sniff it up your nose, and that is accomplished by putting a small amount of the powder on a smooth surface and placing some hollow device over the powder and the other end in your nostril, and sniffing it. That results in it going into the nostril, and the cocaine is absorbed pretty rapidly and results in the desired effect. I will show you a few examples of snort tubes that I have collected over the years. There's an unlimited variety. You can make them out of a McDonald's drinking straw. McDonald's is preferred not because I'm advertising McDonald's, but because it's a larger diameter straw. Oftentimes they roll up a bill, a $10 bill, or if they're high rollers, $100 bill, and then use that rolled up bill as a snort tube. So they're very ingenious, and some of them, of course, have very expensive and ornate snort tubes. The other thing that they have as paraphernalia is small spoons to spoon the desired amount of cocaine onto their surface so that it can be snorted. And I'll show you a couple of those as well. Physiologically, cocaine is an interesting drug. If you rub it on your skin, on the surface of your skin, it acts as a deadener, as a topical anesthetic, if you will. So one of the ways that cocaine users test the cocaine is to rub a little bit on their gums, and if it numbs their gum, then they say, well, this is good stuff. So if you take it internally, it acts as a stimulant. So it stimulates the nervous system inside, depresses the nervous system on the skin. Interesting drug. Cocaine, as I've mentioned, is typically snorted up the nose. That turns out to be a not so good system because it tends to destroy the linings of the nostrils. And I guess if you're thinking about looking cool, it doesn't look too cool to sniff stuff up your nose. So people wanted to figure out a different way to take it. Some people thought, well, maybe we can smoke it. But the hydrochloride salt, which is normally what the cocaine powder is, has a very high melting point, so that doesn't work. But if you convert it from the hydrochloride salt to the free base by removing the hydrochloride, HCl, from the molecule, then that free base melts at a much lower temperature, so that you can heat it up and inhale the vapors, like we talked about with heroin. And so that became a pretty big rage for a while. They would convert the cocaine to a free base, and then they could smoke it. And they did that by adding some base like sodium hydroxide, which is lye, to a solution of cocaine in water, and shaking that up, and the base would remove the acid-base reaction, and then they could extract the free base cocaine using a volatile solvent like ether, and then evaporating the ether, and it'd be left with this free base cocaine. So for a while you could buy freebase kits for $10 or $15, and you could alter your cocaine and make it into freebase cocaine, and then you could smoke it. Well, that works, but it's as a chemist, a couple of things jump out at you. One is that you're having to use a very volatile solvent like ether. Second of all, you're using a really strong base like lye, and neither one of those things are good. You can burn yourself with the lye on your skin, or you could light the ether on fire, and then you blow up your face, which a few unsuspecting cocaine users actually did. So somebody else came up with the idea that if you just put baking soda, then you can remove the hydrochloride salt, and baking soda is not as dangerous as sodium hydroxide. So then you can heat that up to near the boiling point, and if you do it very carefully, at some point the freebase cocaine will crystallize out as small chunks, referred to as rocks in the trade, and those rocks are freebase cocaine. If you do it just right as the crystallization takes place, you may hear a small noise like a crack, and so they call it crack cocaine. So that's what crack cocaine is. Instead of the hydrochloride salt, crack cocaine is the freebase cocaine, and you can make it very easily if you practice a little bit. We had one of the Narcotics Strike Force's snitches come up to our lab one day. He was from Nevada, and he said that he used to make crack during the recess between classes in school. He said they would, whoever was making it would go to his locker, and then a number of students would gather around him so they wouldn't see what he's doing, and he would make up a batch of crack between classes. And he showed us how to do it. He was pretty good at it, and he made some really nice crack cocaine. Crack wasn't as popular in Utah as it was in some other places, primarily larger cities, but we saw significant amounts of it, and occasionally it still arises. The color test that I mentioned earlier, the cobalt thiocyanate, actually does not turn blue with crack. It needs the hydrochloride to activate the color. So if you think you have cocaine and you do a cobalt thiocyanate and it comes up negative, then you should just add a couple of drops of hydrochloric acid to the solution, and if it turns blue, that tells you that the cobalt thiocyanate is getting the HCl salt from the conversion of crack to powder cocaine. So then you know, okay, not only is it cocaine, but it's crack cocaine or freebase cocaine. Crack turns out to be more potent and more dangerous than the regular cocaine powder, and so we had some well-publicized events. Some professional and amateur athletes actually died from using crack, and so it lost its popularity, and we don't see it as often as we did before. Other Schedule II controlled substances are often pharmaceutical commercially made pills, such as OxyContin, Percodan, Percocet, oxycodone, hydrocodone. These are usually found in the condition in which they were made. Maybe they were pills, maybe they were capsules, but they can be at least preliminarily identified by the markings on the pills and their shape. A number of these identification keys are available online, and in fact one of the assignments for the class is to use a pill identifier to identify some characteristics of pills which you may have available to you to examine. So of course you need to do something beyond the pill identifier online. usually some kind of chromatography, paper chromatography, or thin layer chromatography will suffice. Of course, you can always do the more advanced tests, but they usually aren't necessary. Morphine is also Schedule 2, and it is normally also found as either a pill or sometimes in a solution in a regular pharmaceutical bottle with a label on it. So you can treat it the same way we treat the other pills, such as Percodan, Percocet. And look it up on the pill identifier, and of course you can do a marquee on morphine-based products, and do additional chromatographic or instrumental identification for confirmation. Schedule 3 and 4 and 5 are diminishing in potential for abuse and increasing in medical usage. So we don't see them often. We do occasionally see anabolic steroids. Most of the time the law enforcement does not go looking for them. But they do pop up from time to time. Of course, they are used and are famous for their abuse by professional athletes. So there's a booming trade in anabolic steroids, but since they don't usually result in criminal activity such as burglaries and so forth, that is the problem with the other more serious drugs. We don't make many anabolic steroid busts, and so we won't cover that as an issue. They're very complicated to identify and beyond the scope of what this class is designed for.